Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Tomer Persico. I'm a scholar in residence at the Hartman Institute here in the Bay Area and a visiting assistant professor at UC Berkeley for Jewish and Israel Studies. And I welcome you all to our panel about peoplehood, Jewish peoplehood, myth or memory. Now, at Yehuda Kurtzer's introduction, last panel, he talked a little bit about how we can see from quotes from the Bible, from how Haman sees the people of Israel, or how Pharaoh sees Israel, that they are described as a people. And I want to further emphasize that. You can see that the first question that someone who wants to convert to Judaism, at least according to the sages, is, and I quote, "Why would you want to convert? Can't you see that this people is the most subdued and miserable of all peoples?" That's what a converter or a would-be converter is asked first and foremost. And I want us to notice that he is asked, why are you wanting to convert to these people? You're not converting into a religion. You're not joining a kingdom, a nation state. You're joining a certain people. And this is the first centuries AD already. So maybe the fact that the Jews are a people is more than myth and memory. It's pretty well based in our history. In fact, maybe the vision or the description of Jews as a religion or as a nationalistic movement is something a lot more modern. And these are, of course, questions that we will touch on here. And more fundamentally, we will talk about the rift, the division between Jewish peoplehood on one side, on the Israeli side, and on the American side, two Jewish peoples who have a different set of ways of identifying themselves, different ways of describing their own Jewish identity, and whole different sets of values, even maybe different sets of Jewish values. We will try to address the question of the future of this rift, of this people. Now, in order to address these questions, we have here three very distinguished speakers and intellectuals. I want to introduce them. First, Noam Pianko is a Samuel and Storm Chair of the Jewish Studies and professor in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Pianko's research interests include modern Jewish history, Zionism, and American Judaism. His most recent book, Peoplehood and American Innovation, won the American Jewish Historical Society's Saul Wiener Book Prize. We've then got Dr. Daniel Gordis, who is a senior vice president and the correct distinguished fellow at Shalem College, the author of 12 books. Gordis is a regular columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Gordis' History of the Israel, entitled Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, received the 2016 National Book Award as the Book of the Year. In 2014, Jerusalem Post listed him as one of the world's 50 most influential Jews. Gordis' newest book, We Stand Divided, The Rift Between American Jews and Israel, was published in 2019. And he and his wife live in Jerusalem. And last but not least, Sara Hirschhorn is a visiting assistant professor in Israel Studies at the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern University, where her work focuses on diaspora-Israel relations. Her first book, City on Hilltop, American Jews in the Israeli Settler Movement, from Harvard University Press, 2017, was the winner of the 2018 Sammy Rohr Prize in Jewish Literature Choice Award and a finalist for the 2018 National Jewish Book Award. She is currently working on a new book on Zionism and identity politics post-1967. Prior to her appointment in Northwestern, Dr. Hirschhorn was the university research lecturer in Israel Studies at the University of Oxford, and she's also a frequent public speaker, writer, media commentator, and policy consultant on Jewish and Israeli affairs. So, we shall begin with the question, the basic question of Jewish peoplehood. What is it? What defines it? What constitutes it? And I want to turn to Noam and ask you, in your book about Jewish people and American innovation, you write that one cannot meaningfully ask the question, whatever happened to the Jewish people, without first probing the historical origins of the specific constellations of meanings associated with peoplehood. Can you then take us through the historical origins and constellations of peoplehood?
Sure, thank you. Like 5 minutes for each of us?
Yeah, we will have 5 minutes each.
So it's really nice to be here. I wrote the book just so I could be here today at this conference. There's really no other audience, but this is pretty much a good audience. Peoplehood is really an interesting concept. It is a concept because there's a perception that Jewish peoplehood is eternal, that it's something that has defined Jews for centuries. And there's both some truth to that and also, I think, some important ways in which the history of the term points out how it has changed quite dramatically. So as we've already heard a little bit about today, the word Am is one of the examples, a people within Jewish sources and texts. However, the concept of defining Jews as a people is something that comes right out of modern Zionism. In fact, it goes back to the phrase that Theodor Herzl wrote in his book, Wir sind ein Volk, we are one people. And it's interesting that even though we're in Zionist 3.0 here, if you go back to Zionist 1.0, you would see that same folk or people, and on the back that same unity or ein. So we're still very much within sort of the fundamental parameters that Herzl laid out. There was a challenge, though, for American Zionists, like Mordechai Kaplan, who is the person who is most closely associated with the term peoplehood. They had a problem in the early 20th century when they were trying to translate the idea of nation, or folk, or people, into an American culture and into English, because Jews did not feel comfortable distinguishing themselves as a separate national group. As being American, you really want to be a religious minority, not a national or a racial or even ethnic minority. So it was very difficult for American Zionists to actually figure out how to integrate the term nation, which is so key to the Zionist movement, into the American vocabulary. And at first, what Kaplan tried to do was use the term nationality. Nationality was a way of talking about being a national group, but one that is split between a diaspora and a homeland. But starting in the 1930s, Kaplan bumped into a problem, which was that the term nation was now being associated with being citizen of a state. And if Jews and Zionists were talking about a nationality, it would be very difficult for diaspora Jews to be part of that nation. So what Kaplan kind of decided, actually, he was giving a talk about nationality, and somebody there are records of a meeting where somebody in the audience said, we can't use nationhood, we have to use peoplehood instead, because we don't want anybody to think that to be part of this people, you have to be a citizen of the state. So Kaplan adopted the term peoplehood, and that's where that term comes from. So it's quite a recent word and quite a recent concept, and it solved a real dilemma for American Jews, which is, how can we be both a religion in our American hats, because we want all the benefits of being a minority religious community in the United States, and also advocate for the fact that we have a national connection to a homeland. And so peoplehood kind of was able to bridge these two dissonant concepts in the American vocabulary. The other thing that Kaplan wanted peoplehood to do was, Kaplan did not see Zionism as being about fundamentally creating a state. Kaplan understood Zionism as a movement for national cultural revival. And as Zionism became increasingly focused on building the state, and he perceived less so on creating the cultural engine for the Jewish nation all over the world, he wanted to have a different term to define what the goals of Zionism were. What's interesting happened, I think, over time is that even though Kaplan very much saw peoplehood as a critique of statist Zionism, of Zionism that was fundamentally about creating a state, and peoplehood was his alternative to that. I think what's interesting, and I'll kind of wrap it up here, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, is that what has ultimately happened is that Kaplan's concept of an alternate to Zionism, to statist Zionism, I think has become co-opted by a sense of pro-Israelism or advocacy for Israel or even support for Israel, and now is often used as a code word for supporting the state of Israel rather than what Kaplan ultimately wanted the term to be, which was promoting a sense of Jewish national culture all around the world, both in the diaspora and in the homeland.
Thank you, Noam. So Kaplan really made up this concept of peoplehood in order to solve some sort of social problem that American Jews had been going through. I still would like to understand what the role of peoplehood was in a broader sense, in a historical sense. Daniel, maybe can you address this?
Sure. So look, I think it's important to understand the depth and the complexity of what it is that Noam is suggesting, because this idea that Jewish peoplehood is a construct of the modern Zionist political movement is one very prevalent view in academia, but it's by no means the only view in academia. In other words, there are a lot of people actually who point out, I'm not saying that you're making this claim, but there are a lot of people who actually try to suggest who put it even much more acerbically than you are, which is that basically Zionism invented the idea of peoplehood in order to justify the movement, and then some people would even go further and say the taking of the land and so on and so forth. I'm not suggesting in any way that you're saying that. But I think it's by no means a given that the idea of peoplehood arises with the advent of modern political Zionism. Just give you one very brief indication of that, which is if you want to say that the advent of modern political Zionism is either in 1896 when Herzl writes the Jewish state, or in 1897, the year of the first Zionist Congress. In the 1880s, which is prior to both, already the reform movement in America goes to great lengths in the Pittsburgh platform to make it clear that it does not see itself as a people. Now, if peoplehood as a currency only emerges as a result of Zionism, the reform movement wouldn't have had a need to say that in the 1880s because Herzl hadn't done his thing yet. The truth of the matter is that I think a lot of us understand that peoplehood goes back as a central Jewish idea from a very, very, very long time. Pharaoh is the first person in the Bible to talk about the Jews as a people. The very last sentence of the entire Bible is Cyrus speaking, and he says, any of you who is among God's people, you should actually go back to the land of Judea. Pharaoh, by the way, also says, what does he say when he talks about the Jews as a people? They're going to rise up and not take my throne. They're going to rise up and leave and go to the land of Israel. So whether you do that or whether you look at various parts of the liturgy, Asher bachar banu mikolam v'romemanu mikol lashon, people who say Kiddush on holidays, who separated us from other nations, and so on and so forth. The Jews have spoken about themselves as a people for a very, very, very long time. And therefore, I don't completely agree with Noam that the idea of Jews as a peoplehood is a construct of modern political Zionism. I think it predates it. I think Zionism used it for a particular purpose, but it goes way back. And Noam obviously is familiar with all those sources and obviously has a response. Here's what I would say, though. No, I mean, let's just be honest. He's a smart guy. Here's what I think we all need to understand. We used the word peoplehood this morning as a kind of a necessary construct for the way in which we're going to think about this conversation. You can't will yourself into being a people. You can't just say, we're a people. The question is, what is that link? Prior to the Enlightenment, prior to the breakdown of standard, ancient religious motifs, what made the Jews a people was whether they were living in Yemen or they were living in Germany, they actually cared about this text called the Torah, and it was meant to define their lives. Whether they were living in Iraq or whether they were living in France, their liturgy spoke about a yearning to go back to the land of Israel. Wherever they were, and they made a Seder, at the end of the Seder they said, Lashana haba b'Yerushalayim. They had a sense that peoplehood meant a kind of a yearning for a place, and it was defined yearning to be in that place, and it was defined by a series of sacred texts and sacred concepts. What the Enlightenment and modernity do in large measure is destroy those underpinnings. Right? The vast majority of Jews in the world who don't live in Israel today don't want to live in Israel. So when they say Lashana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, they don't actually really mean next year in Jerusalem. They mean that Jerusalem plays an important role in their thinking about the Seder and freedom and so on and so forth, but they don't mean what was meant by it 200 or 300 years ago. By the same token, many people in Israel and outside of Israel don't see those texts anymore as kind of defining of their lives. We don't share a language anymore. Right? There's not one language that Jews, there never was really one language, but there was a period in which when the vast majority of Jews lived in Babylonia, either Aramaic or whatever other language served that purpose. For hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe, where not the vast majority, but a big majority of Jews lived, Yiddish served that purpose, and so on and so forth. So I think the challenge for us today is to actually ask ourselves, what do we mean by peoplehood? And my argument would be, and I'll just stop with this, we can open it up down the road, I think we have to reinvest peoplehood with substantive meaning. I don't think it's enough to say we're a people. We're a people bound by what? Are we bound by a devotion to certain sacred texts? Are we bound by a dream of Jewish Renaissance in the land of Israel? Are we bound by a dream of living there? What exactly do we all share at this point that makes us a people? Now, the people at this particular conference who are going to take time and money out of their lives to come to Z3 obviously have much more in common. But if you were to take your average Israeli and your average American and ask yourself, what do they actually share ideologically, ritually, liturgically, religiously, theologically, and so on and so forth? I think it's not clear. And I think that one of the most important conversations for us to have is, what do we each need to look like and be like in order for peoplehood to actually mean something once again?
Thanks, Daniel. You know, I wonder, why is it that the Jews of all peoples have to define for themselves how are they bound together, what is mutual, what is the common denominator between different... I mean, you've got a lot of peoples around the world that have no definition for that don't think about it. And I'm not saying this disparagingly. Maybe we are, in a way, in a position that this must be defined. But I want to take the last thing you said about the differences between Israel and the United States and ask Sara. You've wrote a lot about Israeli Jewish identity and Jewish identity of Americans coming into Israel. How do you reflect about what comes to light about peoplehood from those experiences?
Well, I think I want to, someone on a panel has to have chutzpah, and I think that is going to have to be me today. And I take a bit of an issue with the way the conference has been framed as one people, two centers, and three opinions, having recently returned from the UK and spending much of my time traveling in other diaspora Jewish communities who also consider themselves centers of Jewish life. Those in Cincinnati and those in Cape Town equally think of themselves as the center of the Jewish universe and want to be part of this discussion. So the idea that the conversation has been framed only as between the United States and Israel, I think, in and of itself presents a problem that we should think about further. I wanted to respond a bit to this question of modernity. I think part of the reason this happens is because Zionism comes into being at the birth of the cusp of the modern era and of modern technology, how people begin to know about each other. If you were a Jew in Baghdad and a Jew in Bologna for most of your existence from medieval times, you knew nothing about one another. Your lives were made up of your local Jewish identities. And the idea that you were part of a global experience, of a global peoplehood, was probably quite foreign to you. Some of the first places, unfortunately, the Jews of different kinds began to meet each other was due to persecution. A Jew from Salonika and a Jew from Lithuania may have met for the first time only at a place like Auschwitz. So it's a very sad consideration for those of us in this room, but peoplehood partially comes out of the encounter between those Jews of many different communities that may not have associated themselves with one another until others had grouped them together, often as part of an experience of oppression. As Yehuda said earlier, it's only our enemies that often think of us as a people. About the American Jewish experience in Israel, I mean, that's obviously a much more fraught question, as Noam has referenced. The idea of peoplehood was, in a way, to evade questions of dual loyalty, of the golden era of American Jewish assimilation. We can remember the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein platform of the 1950s, when the American Jewish community was, and especially the organized American Jewish community, was quite concerned about what its relationship might be to Israel, even after the existence of the state. This wasn't only the Pittsburgh platform, but even into the 1950s, American Jews were very cautious about their relationship with Israel. I think 1967, which is a moment that I've written about extensively, is really the turning point for American Jews in solidifying their connection with Israel. The question for us is, what has happened since 1967? A poll in September 1967 said 99% of American Jews stood in unanimity with Israel. Could we say that today? And what has happened since then?
Thank you, Sara. I'd like you to respond to each other's words, but really I want to propose the very basic thesis that the Jews are simply another ethnic group among many ethnic groups in existence. They were an ethnic group when they came out of Egypt. They were an ethnic group when they formed their first kingdoms in Israel. And really, it is only, and this was said here a few times by you, it's only in modernity that the question, the problematization of Jewish identity rises up. Are we a nation? Are we a religion? Are we a race? Et cetera, et cetera. If so, isn't the answer quite a lot more simple than it seems? It's simply another ethnic entity in the world. Noam, would you respond and also tell us what you think about it?
Sure. I mean, I'm trying to figure out what relation between an ethnic identity versus a peoplehood identity. These are all kind of, ethnicity as a term is also relatively new in terms of what it means, and it's a way of replacing race. So, but I think I'd like to go back to this, the conversation that, Danny, you and I kind of started having about whether or not Zionism is a modern construction or not is obviously one that is deeply political, in the sense that this has the line about how people debate whether or not Jews have our national group and go back to the land of Israel and to create the state of Israel. And I think the point that I want to emphasize is, it's not did they or didn't they, it's that why has it that what has emerged as the unifying factor is the state of Israel, rather than all of the different really theological ways in which was historically understood. So I think what's new is not necessarily whether there was a sense of collectivity or even a yearning for the homeland. I think what is new is the idea that unity itself can happen without it's a political, not a theological. Mm-hmm. And that to me is very significant. And the reason it's important for us today is because as American Jews, what's the relationship between peoplehood and the state of Israel? And I think if you see a longer history of having this political connection to the homeland and a territorial connection, then it makes sense that understanding peoplehood today would be very closely connected to connection to the state of Israel. If you see that as something that is a shift from a much more kind of theological, religious, and really multicultural sense of Jewishness that added historically, then you could divide up this notion of collectivity and peoplehood from a connection to the modern state of Israel. And I guess my big framing question for this particular panel at this conference is, what is the relationship between peoplehood and connection to the state of Israel? I mean, would it be possible to have members of the Jewish people who may not actually be Zionists in their orientation, or at least may have serious criticisms of Israel? That was certainly possible for hundreds of years in the past. Is it still possible today? I think there's become an increasing sense that membership in the Jewish people is connected in a certain relationship to the state of Israel. And to me, that is one of the key potentially fragmenting issues facing the American Jewish community today, is whether or not membership in the Jewish people, this historical people, is connected to your views in the state of Israel. Can you disconnect those? Like the same way we don't expect everybody who's a member of the Jewish people to keep Shabbat, right? It wouldn't be crazy to have a big Jewish institution saying any religious practice can come and be part of our community. You can maybe you can marry somebody who's not Jewish, as long as you're raising your family Jewish, come to our community. But if you hold a certain political position about Israel, then you are not necessarily part of the Jewish people. So I guess the reason for me it's so important to think about the potential ways in which this term has shifted over time is to get at that very fundamental question. When we say Jewish people and we say we are trying to unify, are we really trying to get everybody, or are we trying to set pretty clear parameters that define identity as diverse as long as you are in certain parameters about your relationship to the state of Israel?
But no, I have to ask, I mean, does anybody doubt that a Satmar Hasid, who is very much anti-Zionist, believes that the state of Israel is itself a sin in existence, hopes for its demise, right? Does anybody doubt that he is part of the Jewish people?
Well, I think the more, I think because first of all, I'm sure there are, right? They're called anti-Zion, some of them in Israel, but I think for this kind of a mainstream American Jewish community. The real question is those who are on the lines of protesting or criticizing Israel for its policies and believe that those are not the best for the Jewish people. In other words, they believe their vision of what it means to be part of the Jewish people is a religious and moral vision that they might believe that the state is in conflict with. So I think Satmar, because of the who's in this conversation, they are generally outside of the conversation. But I think what Peoplehood is a way for non-ultra-Orthodox, and even Orthodox Jews to some extent, to define the group tent. Peoplehood is used, and it often correlates to positions on Israel in terms of where the boundaries of that tent are. And I just think it's worth acknowledging that and pointing that out.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's good to understand, to view this through a lens of Jewish identity. And then there are a few components that can make up your Jewish identity. One of them is halakha. One of them is observance of the law. One of them is the love of Israel, patriotism, nationalism, etc. You have to have a certain kind. You have to hold one of them, and then you are considered in
right, but peoplehood privileges the secular, national, ethnic connection.
Okay.
And I think American Jews have, in a sense, used that term peoplehood, and who's included in that has a lot more to do with that one criteria than all the other possible criteria that you could use to define who's part of this collective. And I guess my question is that the way we want to use the term? Do we mean that? Or should we disconnect peoplehood from connection to the state of Israel, or make that equal to all the other possible ways that you could be part of the Jewish people?
So the term has come to mean a certain attitude towards the state of Israel.
I believe it's also, you'll hear, even this morning we heard somebody said, Jewish peoplehood and, Jewish peoplehood / the state of Israel, Jewish people in Israel. Like the terms are often actually interchangeable, I think.
Look, I think that's right, but we're just wrapping up a period of 7 months living in Boston for reasons that don't matter. No, but I learned a lot. I mean, it's really very different to spend, the first half of your life or whatever in America, then move to Israel and come back very, very often, as opposed to just really plunking yourself down in a city and living back inside American Jewish life. And I had a fascinating experience just a couple of weeks ago. I was invited to be a fly on the wall among a group of Jewish professionals who meet regularly in New York. There are Federation people, Foundation people, some rabbis. I mean, they're just some very, very, very smart men and women. And they meet apparently regularly for some lunch in New York, and I was invited to come be a fly on the wall. Just listen and whatever. What was fascinating to me was, and the conversation is not directed. They serve the food and then people talk. And the conversation ended up being about the new phenomenon that these people are all encountering, that young American Jews who care deeply about being Jewish are constructing a Jewish identity in which Israel is not a factor. They're not anti. They're not pro. Israel is just no more connected to their constructed Jewish identity than is Pakistan. It just doesn't come up. And I'll give you another little interesting indication. We lived in Boston for about 7 months, and we went to a bunch of different minyanim. One of them was an Orthodox minyan, one of them was an egalitarian minyan, sort of covering all my theological bases, just, who knows what she really thinks. So in any event, right, in the 6 or 7 months that we were in Boston, hardly ever missing a Shabbat of going to shul, not in one Dvar Torah of any sort in 7 months did I hear the word Israel mentioned. Not one. Not at the Orthodox minyan at Harvard Hillel, not at the Cambridge minyan, nothing. And I take that as an indication of proving what you're saying to be correct. In other words, and we're proving what these people are saying also. Partly, I think it's motivated by the fact that Israel is not a unifying factor anymore. Israel's become a very divisive factor. So one of the ways of keeping your minyan together is to actually not talk about the thing that is the most divisive and explosive and toxic. I'm sure you're all aware of lots of studies that show that the one topic that rabbis will not talk about from the pulpit is Israel. Right? And imagine where we've gotten to, right? If a rabbi gets up on a Shabbat morning and she says, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't think anything happened at Sinai. Okay. Right? And if she gets up one Shabbat morning and she says, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think the Palestinians are not a people and they don't deserve a state, she can start packing. No, but I'm serious. We've gotten to a point where a claim about Israel can get you fired, but a claim about a fundamental tenet of classical Jewish religion, people like, whatever, because we don't take religion that seriously. So we really don't. We really, as a Jewish people here, don't take religion that seriously. This is part of the reason, by the way, we don't understand the Middle East. because there are people there for whom religion is entirely non-negotiable. So if you believe that a certain part of the world is a Muslim part of the world, you're not going to compromise on that. It is not territorially compromisable. We look at it as let's make a deal. They look at it as a fundamental religious tenet, which is part of the reason that there's a complete disconnect. So what I would say is I think that we're in a very, very interesting place. And I would personally say I don't think my Zionist credentials are actually that much in question. So I will therefore allow myself to say that I think of people who don't care at all about the Jewish state as being totally part of the Jewish religion, part of the Jewish people, 100%. I think, Satmar Hasidim are the best example, and I hear, I think if you're going to dress like that, we're just going to call you Jewish. You know what I mean? It's just, if you're going to put up with that, but I'll give you a much more serious example. An organization in America called If Not Now, which is made up of lots of young, smart men and women who are post-college, late 20s, early 30s, who specifically state on their website that they do not take a position on Jewish statehood. They're not against, they're not for. They're the ones that say, it's just not a tenet of who we are. Do I disagree with them? I disagree with them completely. Do I think they're part of the Jewish people? 1,000%. So I think that what we have to figure out, though, is at the end of the day, what makes them part of the Jewish people? And what I would say is what makes them part of the Jewish people is they actually cite Jewish sources when they make their arguments. They make their arguments about political positions that I don't particularly share, that I think put my country in a certain degree of danger, which is why we disagree profoundly. But I actually do respect the deep, profound Jewish wellspring from which their political activism comes. But the question becomes, what about those people for whom that activism isn't part of their life? In other words, they're not theologically involved, they're not Zionist involved, they're not textually aware that mass of Jews, especially in the United States, who are not at this conference, what in any kind of meaningful way makes them part of the Jewish people? I think that they don't have an answer to that question themselves, by the way, and that's why when we sort of scratch our heads and say, why are 70% of people who are not Orthodox marrying non-Jews? The question is, why are 30% marrying Jews? No, I'm really 1,000% serious about that. Because the vast majority of people that they're meeting are not Jews. And I think that part of what we're running up against in America is where these really shifting sands of the definition of Jewish peoplehood. For people like us in this room, that's disconcerting and it's hard to wrap our arms around. But I would simply say I think that we're witness to a profound shifting seas of what makes up peoplehood. And it's not clear to me that for the vast majority of American Jews, there's anything that one can point to about them that would then tie them to that people.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
About, this generation of If Not Now leaders are some of my students, or like Noam's, or at least some of his, and we're very close to the ground in relating to them. There certainly is a segment who have embraced diasporism as an identity, one that generally excludes Israel, either by omission or by commission, in terms of of their relationship. But I also wonder how many of them are actually choosing this identity for themselves, or whether the progressive community more largely is enforcing some of these boundaries upon them. And it's a very different kind of decision about peoplehood to choose that for yourself, or to be asked to say, check your Zionism at the door of the progressive camp in order to be a member there. So I think we need to be very careful about who is really imposing some of these boundaries upon us, and what is defining peoplehood. Is it us or is it them? And that's a very large distinction. I would answer to your question about, are we just another ethno-national identity like any other? I think the difference between us and everyone else is that we call ourselves the chosen people, right? And we can't really evade that signifier. And that I think is what sets us apart. Though, as Yehuda said in the opening plenary, we're always in tension between whether we want to be a people apart or a people just like everyone else. The last thing I would say about the kind of emptiness of peoplehood as a signifier, and I think even for some sort of as kind of a virtue signifier, is that the reason that our peoplehood as American Jews is so empty is, I think, because we don't see ourselves in peoplehood with anybody except Israeli Jews. We don't think of ourselves in peoplehood with Mexican Jews or Canadian Jews or Australian Jews or French Jews. Our entire focus of our energy is on Israel. And I think that if you go to other diaspora Jewish communities around the world, they are desperately concerned and very, very interested in what's happening with us here in the United States. How much are we thinking about them in Melbourne or Marseille or Johannesburg, or not, only, several hundred miles from here in California, in, say, Mexico City. And I think part of the reason we need to think about peoplehood more as a stronger category is we really need to think about who else we're in peoplehood with, and that's with all of global Jewry and not just with Israel. And I think that we'd have much more substance to our identity as a people if we were really thinking about ourselves as a people and not just as two connected entities across an ocean.
Thank you. I want to go back to what Daniel has said about congregations who the rabbi can say pretty much anything about the Sinai revelation, but cannot say almost anything about Israel. And you said it's because we don't really care about religion. And I would like to make this a bit more complicated. It's not because these congregations just don't care, come for the lax, the bagel and lax, and then go home, or for the mingling. They care deeply, and they care deeply about certain values that the insertion of Israel into the daily talk will trigger, right? They care deeply about liberal values, and not only that, many of them have taken liberal values and made them into their sort of Jewish identity. That's the central. These are the central tenets, these are the central backbone of their Jewish identity. And if this is so, the more these people are in touch with their Jewish identity, the more they care about their Jewish identity, the further away they will be from Israel as it is now. Not very liberal, let's say challenged democratically, etc. This may be a central reason for the widening gulf between young people here or anyone here who will define their Judaism in liberal terms.
Well, the problem with somebody defining, I don't disagree with you completely, but I think the danger of talking about people who define their Judaism in liberal terms is what's different about that definition than what's taking place in the Protestant church across the street? How are those values really different? And since I think they're not, I would argue that it's basically fundamentally defining themselves as progressives or as liberals or as something else. It's more or less a political definition, which they're attaching the word Jewish to. Completely they're right. But I think for something to be authentically, meaningfully, leave out authentically, for something to be meaningfully Jewish, I think we have to be able to say something about how it is countercultural to the larger culture in which we live. That has nothing to do with Israel necessarily. But I think to whatever extent we're talking about, all of the various values that come together in this whole intersectionality thing that Yitz Greenberg was talking about before, I just personally struggle to see how the Protestant church on one side of the street and the liberal shul on the other side of the street, both of which stand for really important and wonderful things, how the differences between them are really substantive.
There's something a little bit, ironic of that from some bit, from the Zionist perspective of trying to be like every other national group, So
but I don't think we're trying to be. I don't think the Zionists. I think, the Am Kechol Ha'amim kind of thing that we were trying to be like every other national group. I just don't think that that's true. In other words, we wanted to be like other national groups in certain kinds of ways. But I think Israelis take a tremendous sense of pride in what is distinct and unique about Israel.
Right. I think we also have to ask what's really Jewish about Jewish power, which is maybe the real essence of the question here.
Right.
What's Jewish about having a state like everybody else's? In other words, I guess you could argue, well, if you're in the state, there's going to be less intermarriage, or however you want to articulate it.
But it's not a state like everybody else's, but okay.
But so I guess for me, the issue is less, is it going to be a problem to be similar to liberal Protestants? It's more about the existential risk facing American Jews now, in my mind, has a lot to do with ensuring minority democratic rights for our community in this country, that they are deeply under threat. And so I don't look at intersectionality as a way of keeping out Jews. I'm not here to defend intersectionality, but I am here to defend the importance of progressive ideals for many American Jews. And I think one of the greatest challenges of peoplehood is that it places a connection, either explicit or implicit, to the state of Israel above other priorities that Jews might have. And I think that it's that that's causing the rift, because peoplehood is used, for example, in the nation-state bill, right? This is the nation-state of the Jewish people. The idea that we're one people is used to define how Israel treats its various citizens, and possibly how it treats their citizens differently. In other words, if it's the nation-state of Jewish people, it's not the nation-state of all of its citizens. If you're an American Jew, it is deeply important, far more important than whether I'm similar to the Protestants or not similar to the Protestants. I want to make sure that this country continues to define itself as a state that is committed to all of its citizens and not to one ethno-religious group. And so I think what peoplehood has, in some ways, it might actually undermine and point out the tensions that are rising between these two communities, because we are fundamentally moving in different directions vis-a-vis the role that the state has with majority and minority populations. So at its core, peoplehood could actually be undermining the relationship, because it is so focused on unity that it is not willing to recognize that the points of fracture are really important points. They're that we have fundamentally different priorities, political priorities, given that we live in different places. And I think that peoplehood gives a privilege to those who are willing to put their priority to the nation-state of the Jewish people over their priority as minority citizens in the United States who are deeply committed to progressive liberal ideals in this country.
So you see that as a problem of peoplehood.
Excuse me? That's a problem, that peoplehood actually is forcing Jews to make a decision. It's forcing Jews to decide who are they with first, rather than recognizing that you have multiple connections and that you don't have to put one over the other, and that the only litmus test for what it means to have Jewish values is not necessarily supporting I'm not saying they're not reconcilable, but we've got to acknowledge that there is an increasingly large tension between American progressive values, especially in the Trump era, and the way that Israel is perceived and how it is moving increasingly in a non-democratic direction. And American Jews are increasingly fighting for a more democratic direction in this country.
How's Israel moving?
No, I think it also, it also really asks the question of, is there an optimistic future for Jews living as a minority anywhere, which I guess is embedded in your description of the clash between American Jews and Israel, or whether really, I think, at least for Zionists, the consideration is that is not a future, whether it's in the United States or in France or anywhere else, that really the only place.
We've actually, and what Z3 is sort of saying is that we're at a time we have to acknowledge that both communities are okay. I actually think that's not the situation. We've reopened that question of Z1, which is which community is going to survive, and it's increasingly looking like an either or, because global politics are going in mutually exclusive directions, and there are increasing arguments to say, look, if populism and nationalism is becoming the direction of the world, you better go to your nation state, because that's the only one that's going to protect you, right? And that's why many white nationalists are very supportive of Zionism. That's their worldview. On the other hand, if you're believe that preserving liberal values and minority values as American Jews, then you better align yourself as strong as you can with all of the other communities, even those that may be opposing to Israel, because your values are about safety and security in this country. So we've reopened the fundamental Zionism 1.0 question today, and I think that's where the core of the challenge is between our communities.
You want to say?
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, there's been a couple of throwaway lines about how, it was not only here, but earlier today also, that Israel's moving in an increasingly non-democratic direction. I don't see any indication of that. What's the indication of that?
I can give you
one very simple indication of it is if you look at the current way in which the elections are playing out, the third largest party in the recent Knesset elections are to an Arab party. In a true democracy, you would not be able to push out a certain party because of their ethnic or religious beliefs, right? The fact that even though they want to join the coalition, they are not allowed to join the coalition means that Arab citizens of Israel are unable to sit in the majority, which means they're unable to represent their voices in the national government.
Okay, so first of all, look, I think this is a really, really important question, because our views of it are so different that it actually, I think, then affects how we can talk about ourselves as being part of the same people. The Arab minority, speaking as somebody who, first of all, we use the word democracy. Israel's democracy and American democracy, two radically different kinds of democracy. America is supposed to be an ethnic blind democracy. If America in 100 years is mostly Hispanic, demographically, America is mostly Hispanic, right? And so therefore Congress is mostly Hispanic. And the president is Hispanic. Is that a failure or a success of American democracy? It's a complete success of American democracy, right? Now, if Israel becomes in 100 years mostly Arab, and the Knesset is mostly Arab, and the prime minister is therefore an Arab, is that a failure or a success of Israeli democracy? It is a success of the apparatus of democracy, but it is not a success of the Zionist dream, which was to be a nation state of the Jewish people. When the Balfour Declaration says in 1917 that His Majesty's government view would favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, what it's saying is it's a very different kind of enterprise from what America is. And part of the mistake that I think we make, I mean, you understand all this, but part of the mistake that we make is that we're holding Israel accountable to a standard of democracy, which is the American standard, when the countries have two radically different purposes. The problem...
Daniel.
One sentence. The only other thing that I'll say is I think it's fabulous that Israeli Arabs are beginning to vote in greater numbers. I think that's an incredibly important statement. They are 20% of Israel's population. In an ideal world, they would be 20% of the Knesset. And now, why are Israeli parties like Blue and White and Likud very reticent to make a deal with them? Because ask Ayman Odeh, the head of the Joint List, are you willing to endorse the idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state? And he will not answer that question. Now, from his point of view, I get it. If I was an Israeli Arab, why would I endorse the idea of a Jewish and democratic state? I wouldn't, and he doesn't, and I respect that. But you can understand why other Israeli parties who want to show how loyal they are to the dream of the Jewish state are saying, I recognize and welcome their increasing participation in the Knesset, but I'm not going to make a coalition with people who refuse to identify with this core purpose of the Jewish state. That's where using an American measure of democracy and applying it to Israel is always going to set Israel to come up short, which is always going to set it up for a younger generation of American Jews to look at Israel as a failed democracy or as a failing democracy, when the fact of the matter is that it's a completely successful democracy with an entirely different set of purposes.
Well, what?
Okay.
I mean, I think the question is, at what point, if we go back to this idea of Jewish and democratic, is there a limit to that? I mean, what happens if the actual number of Arab Israelis grows significantly, or if there's an annexation of the West Bank, which is something that the government is now talking about? At what point, when you have a minority group of Jews who are ruling over a majority, is there a point at which, to be Jewish and democratic, you would have to change the structures of the state? Because if you follow that logic to 100 years from now, you will get into a situation where you will have to have a small minority of Jews who are ruling over a group of non-Jews who don't have political power. Is that still democracy? In other words, is there a limit to that statement, and are we getting closer? We're certainly getting closer and closer to that limit, and I think it's not enough to say it's different. It's different, yes, within the green line. Once you start adding all the other complexities of what's going on today, once you add into it the situation in terms of the possibility of annexing the West Bank becoming a mainstream political opportunity, once you look at the complete kind of failure of the left in Israel and the democratic left, it is increasingly hard to say it is just a democracy with an asterisk toward an ethnic democracy. It is moving in a different direction. And I guess my question is, at what point does it get to a point where it's no longer democracy?
Well, but I guess the question is also, is the Torah...
Sara, can we come back to the subject of peoplehood?
Can I
connected.
just finish? Yes,
I'm sure.
connected.
Yes,
Yes,
okay.
my question about peoplehood, is the Torah of American Judaism tikkun olam, or is the Torah and democracy and liberal values, or is it something else? And that's, I think, also the question that we're getting to here, because the substance of Zionism, and certainly the substance, I think, of Judaism, is not only tikkun olam. That's only one portion of the larger Torah. The Torah of Jewish peoplehood, if I can, be so bold. So I think we're putting the emphasis on this question of Jewish and democratic, and I think American Jews will have to ask themselves: is the essence of Judaism to be, a proud progressive, or is it something else? And these two values are coming into conflict. And certainly, if you're living in an American Jewish context where textual knowledge is not necessarily part of the Jewish experience anymore, Holocaust memory is not necessarily part of our experience anymore, then these questions become even more enlivened, because what is there really to hold on to? And I think Danny would probably have a lot more to say about that.
No, I just think you've just actually echoed what I said at the beginning, that I think we're actually making as a kind of an assumption today that obviously we're one people, and therefore we have to figure out how to bring these two parts together. And I think that we should take a big step back and ask ourselves, are we really in fact one people? And if we are one people, what actually defines our one peopleness? What's the substance of peoplehood? And I think that's really the operative question. And I would suggest that when we think about it, we have to acknowledge that it's much less obvious that we still share something sufficiently thick and meaningful to call ourselves a people than we often want to acknowledge.
Then what is the future of peoplehood? What do you think will come out of this conception, if at all? I mean, maybe we should just give it up.
Well, I don't think we should just give it up. And I'll tell you, look, I think first of all, I say the following not in any attempt to be humorous whatsoever. But one of the things that may actually bring peoplehood back to the fore is that the sickness of anti-Semitism is rising up everywhere. And anybody who thinks it's reached its apex in America just doesn't know anything about the history of anti-Semitism. You know anything about anti-Semitism, you know that when a society becomes hate-filled and rancorous and the well springs of goodwill and civility run empty, they come for the Jews. I'm not talking about camps and trains, don't get me wrong. But the Jews will find themselves in the crosshairs of that kind of a society, and the likelihood that that's not going to happen here, and that we're only seeing, and look, who knows, God forbid, and I hope I'm wrong, but it would seem to me that part of what we may find for Jews in Europe and Jews in South Africa and Jews in Australia, where this is becoming an issue again, and Jews in England, where if Corbyn is elected, it's going to become largely uninhabitable, and Israel now faced with another nuclear threat. I mean, one of the great ironies of the world is that every now and then we're reminded that we actually are part of the same people, because even though we don't necessarily know what the content of that is, the outside world defines us that way, and that's a tragic thing. But let's understand that if 15, 20 years ago we thought that was all in the past, we now understand that it's not in the past.
Go ahead.
I would argue this. I think that we can't give it up, and here's the reason that I think we shouldn't give it up, and I'll say it in one very quick sentence. There's no diaspora community in the history of the world that has survived forever. The great Babylonian diaspora that gave us the Talmud with the rise of Islam. Golden Age of Spain, Portugal, etc., gone with the Inquisition. We all know what happened with the betrayal of the Jews by Christian Europe in the 20th century. We know what happened with the betrayal of the Jews by Islam in the in the Levant in the middle of the 20th century. I think we ought to be very, very careful before we assume that this is the one diaspora in the history of the Jewish people that's going to kind of negate that rule. However, no sovereign Jewish entity in the land of Israel has ever lasted more than 70 or 80 years. Right? King David, King Solomon, and plus 2 years of Rechavam is 82 years, fine. And then if you look at from the Maccabean revolt, from the time that the Jews were actually sovereign until Pompey basically comes back and takes Jerusalem, it's also about 80-something years. We're 71 years in. Israelis ought to have that same kind of humility. Israelis ought to also say to themselves, why do we assume that we're going to be the ones to survive? It's never happened before. And then the question becomes, do we think we as Jews have something really important to say to the world? My own personal argument is, we do have something important to say to the world. I couldn't really care less what Jews eat. And I couldn't care less what Jews wear. And I couldn't care less who gets tattooed and who gets pierced and who davens 3 times a day and who doesn't daven 3 times a day. I frankly couldn't even care less who's a Zionist and who's not a Zionist. We're just going to disagree about that. I'm deeply, passionately committed to the Jewish state, where I think something unprecedentedly wonderful is happening to the Jewish people, but not everybody agrees with that, and that's totally fine. But the one thing that I think is non-negotiable is a belief that we have something important to say to the world. We can't have something important to say to the world if we're entirely ignorant of what our tradition has always said. And unless we can re-inject Jewish substance into ourselves, then I think we're actually not going to make it. But if we can re-inject Jewish substance into our conversations, into our education, and to our lives as communities, then what we're going to recognize is that nobody has the right to write off the other half, because history tells us that no sovereign Jewish entity in the land of Israel survived for very long, and no diaspora has ever survived forever, None of us dare bet on putting all of our eggs in one basket. If the Jewish message to the world really matters, what we have to do is to protect Jewish people everywhere in the world in the widest array of ways in which they live out their Jewish lives.
Thank you.
One of the
You talk in your book about moving from essence to action, from being to doing, about peoplehood. Is that the future of peoplehood?
So just to go back to this anti-Semitism way of the external seeing us, I think one of the additional challenges that has come up and certainly the last several months is that we can't agree on what anti-Semitism is. And in that way, anti-Semitism is actually becoming increasingly a fragmenting part of our collective identity.
I think that's true in the academy. I think in the regular streets,
gonna
people
say everybody
understand
else.
exactly. people
Everybody
understand
else
exactly
except
what
in our
anti-Semitism
universe.
is.
I don't think that's. I mean, maybe I'm totally cut off from the world, but I'm also part of the general community, and I think that the definition of it is very difficult to see the expanding definition of the relationship between anti-Israel and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And my sense is that that's getting increasingly complicated. And I think, I'm dealing with young adults, who are asking me questions like, well, what is anti-Semitism? When is it anti-Zionism? What's the relationship? I don't think it's obvious for everybody. I think it's the President of the United States, right, who's saying that basically if you align yourself with a Muslim American congresswoman and you don't follow my perspective on it, then you are basically anti-Jewish, right? So we are seeing at the highest level of our politics, and I don't think it's just something in the academy. I think there really is a real disagreement about where the real threat comes from, whether it's a threat from the left and the left's criticism of Israel and boycott and divestment, or whether it's from the right and white nationalists, and when an anti-Semitic event happens, whether or not you are equal to say it happened to the left and the right, only the left, only the right, we have to focus our energies here. That does seem to me a real question. I don't think it's only an esoteric question. So I think anti-Semitism will be something that's increasingly hard for us to agree on. In terms of the future of peoplehood, the challenge with peoplehood is it's much more important for somebody who lives in Israel and to affirm Jewish peoplehood than for somebody who lives in the United States. Because fundamentally, the Zionist vision, and now in the basic law, is the idea that the purpose of the state is to support all the Jewish people. So there is a key connection. I think for diaspora Jews, the role of peoplehood is much less central. And so that itself, the term does privilege and is more important for one side than the other. So the question is, if we ultimately want to build collectivity, if we want to find common ground, can we do it with a terminology that prioritizes one of these communities and one of these centers versus the other? Or should we come up with another kind of term, or just focus on letting individual communities work on their different Jewish identities in whatever way they are, and finding the similarities that bubble up in a grassroots movement? I love the idea that we have something to say. I think the problem is we fundamentally believe we have different things to say. Everybody believes something to say, but what that is, when we actually articulate it, can look really different and even mutually conflicting. And when we have ideals like peoplehood, we expect us to utter the same thing at the end of the day. And I think we have to realize that Jews have always uttered really different things. Right. And the key is, and I agree with you what you said earlier, when you go back to, we should be going back to our sources and understanding them and living Jewish lives and interpreting what we have to say in different ways without the pressure of having to come together with a unified vision of what it is that we all have to say together.
Thank you. We really have to.
Can I take the last word, though, so at
Of
least I
course.
get a chance to weigh in on what I think the future of Jewish peoplehood is?
So the last-
Look, I think since 1967, for better or worse, we've been locked into a battle of identity politics. First, this was good for the Jews. It was a celebration of our ethnic identities, much like any other white ethnic in the United States. Later, perhaps this turned against us a bit, that we're now locked into a kind of cycle of oppression Olympics of who has the broader claims to victimhood. But the truth is that since 1967, we've had the privilege of having hyphenated identities in America. We're Jewish Americans. So I think we need to think a little bit more about what both sides of those hyphens mean. What does being Jewish mean as much as being American? Are those two things the same? Or is there some kind of value added in our Jewishness that adds to this identity? And how will we see that kind of Jewishness that we think of ourselves in this hyphenated sense in the same way as we see ourselves in consort with, say, Jewish South Africans, and how are they thinking about this? We live in a time where peoplehood is a contested concept, but we also live in one of the most optimistic moments of Jewish history. We now have Jewish power, something we haven't had in 2,000 years. We have to think about what Jewish power means. Does Jewish power also come with Jewish responsibility? I certainly hope so, and I think that I hope that other Jews, not only in Israel, but also in other Jewish diasporas, are thinking about how to define that for themselves. But we live in a moment of great diversity, of great innovation, I think of great hopefulness. So I hope that we will take that opportunity to look at both sides of the hyphen and really think about what it means for us to be Jewish Americans in dialogue with the rest of the Jewish people in Israel and in everywhere else.
Thank you. Thank you, Sara Hirschhorn. Thank you, Daniel Gordis. Thank you, Noam Pianko. I'm Tomer Persico. Thank you all for coming and listening.
Kol hakavod.